The stagecoach rattled into Tombstone, Arizona territory on a scorching afternoon in July of 1881, carrying a young woman who had been told her entire life that her face would never launch ships or turn heads, and 23-year-old Clara Hartwell had learned to believe it. Her aunt's voice still echoed in her mind from that morning in Philadelphia, sharp as broken glass, telling her that no decent man would marry a girl with a crooked nose and freckles scattered across her cheeks like spilled cinnamon, that her too wide mouth and the scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall made her unmarriageable. Clara had endured 18 years of such comments before her parents died of fever, and 5 more years living under her aunt's roof, working as an unpaid servant while her prettier cousins married well and moved into fine houses. When the letter came from her late mother's brother in Tombstone, offering her a position keeping house for him and his mining partner, Clara had packed her single trunk and left without looking back. The desert heat hit her like a physical blow as she stepped down from the stage, her dark traveling dress absorbing every ray of the brutal sun. Dust coated everything, turning the street a uniform shade of tan, and the buildings looked raw and temporary, as though a strong wind might blow them away. Men in broad-brimmed hats moved along the wooden sidewalks, their boots heavy on the planks, and somewhere a piano played badly out of tune. Clara clutched her carpet bag and looked around for her uncle, but the crowd of faces meant nothing to her. "Miss Hartwell?" A weathered man with silver in his beard approached, removing his hat. "I'm Samuel Chen, your uncle's partner. Thomas took sick yesterday, nothing serious, but he asked me to fetch you. Welcome to Tombstone." Clara shook his offered hand, surprised by his kindness and the slight accent in his words. She had not expected her uncle's partner to be Chinese, but Samuel's eyes held warmth, and she was grateful not to be alone. He collected her trunk from the stage driver and led her toward a buckboard wagon, talking easily about the town and the silver mine they operated in the hills. The wagon seat was hard beneath her, and every bump in the road sent jarring shocks through her spine as they headed out of town toward the small house her uncle maintained. The house sat squat and lonely against the hills, adobe walls thick against the heat, with a wooden porch that provided slim shade. Inside, her Uncle Thomas lay on a narrow bed, his face flushed with fever but his smile genuine. "Clara, girl, you look just like your mother. I am glad you have come. This place needs a woman's touch, and I need family around me." She set to work immediately, finding comfort in familiar tasks. The house was a bachelor's disaster, with dust in every corner and dishes piled in the dry sink. She heated water, scrubbed surfaces, organized the meager pantry, and made soup from salt pork and beans. By evening, her uncle's fever had broken, and he sat up to eat properly, praising her cooking with an enthusiasm that made her chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. No one had praised her for anything in years. The next morning, Samuel arrived before dawn to take her uncle to the mine, and Clara began the harder work of making the house truly livable. She swept and scrubbed, beat rugs outside until the dust cloud made her cough, and discovered that mice had gotten into the flour barrel. She made a list of supplies needed and walked the 2 miles into town as the sun climbed, her bonnet barely adequate against the glare. The general store was dim and cool, smelling of coffee and pickles and new fabric. She moved through it carefully, selecting necessities and trying not to think about how quickly her small savings would vanish. As she waited for the clerk to tally her purchases, 3 women entered, their dresses fine and their manner assured. They looked at Clara with the quick, dismissive glance she knew too well, taking in her plain dress and sun-reddened face, and one of them whispered something that made the others laugh. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes on the counter. The clerk, a young man with pomaded hair, barely looked at her as he named the total. She paid, gathered her parcels, and was turning to leave when one of the women spoke loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Did you see her face? Poor thing. Out here, I suppose even the homely ones think they might find a husband, but that nose and those freckles." The women laughed, a sound like breaking crystal, and Clara walked faster, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. She was halfway down the street, her parcels awkward in her arms, when a man's voice called out, "Ma'am, you dropped something." Clara turned, blinking hard, and found herself looking at a cowboy. He was tall and lean, with dark hair curling over his collar and eyes the color of creek water, perhaps 25 or 26 years old. His clothes were dusty from riding, his hat pushed back on his head, and he held out a spool of thread that must have fallen from her packages. But he was not looking at the thread, he was looking at her face with an expression she could not read, something like wonder. "Thank you," she managed, reaching for the spool. Their fingers brushed, and he smiled, a slow curve of his mouth that made her heart skip strangely. "I am Jake Morrison," he said. "I work at the Flying W Ranch east of town. I have not seen you before." "I am Clara Hartwell. I arrived yesterday to keep house for my uncle." She felt awkward under his gaze, too aware of her flaws, and started to turn away. "Wait," he said, and something in his tone made her pause. "I heard what those women said in the store. They are wrong." Clara's throat tightened. "You do not need to be kind." "I am not being kind." He stepped closer, his eyes serious. "I am being honest. You are perfect to me." The words hung in the hot air between them, impossible and transformative. Clara stared at him, searching for mockery in his face and finding none, only sincerity that made her want to cry and laugh at once. "You do not know me." "Then let me know you." His smile returned, gentler now. "May I call on you, Miss Hartwell?" She should have said no. She should have protected herself from inevitable disappointment. But something in his eyes made her reckless, and she found herself giving him directions to her uncle's house before her common sense could intervene. He tipped his hat, and she watched him walk away, her heart beating a rhythm that felt like hope. That evening, she told her uncle about the encounter, half expecting him to warn her off, but Thomas only smiled. "Jake Morrison is a good man. His family has the ranch east of here, decent spread. He has a reputation for being honest and working hard. If he wants to call on you, Clara, you could do worse." Samuel, sharing their supper, nodded agreement. "I know his father. Good people. Jake is not the kind to play games with a woman's heart." Clara lay awake that night on her narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert and letting herself imagine things she had long ago stopped dreaming about. The possibility of someone seeing her as beautiful felt fragile as spun glass, but Jake's words replayed in her mind, and she could not help but smile into the darkness. He came 3 days later. Riding up in the evening when the worst heat had passed, Clara saw him from the kitchen window and quickly checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door, then cursed herself for caring. She had changed from her work dress into her better calico, the blue one with small white flowers, and braided her brown hair neatly. Her face looked back at her, the same as always, crooked nose, scattered freckles, too wide mouth. But she lifted her chin and went out to meet him. Jake stood beside his horse, a fine chestnut mare, and held his hat in his hands. "Miss Hartwell, I was hoping you might walk with me, if your uncle approves." Thomas had come to the door and he nodded. "Go on, Clara. Be back before full dark." They walked toward the hills, following a faint path through the scrub. The evening air was cooler but still warm, and the sky had begun to turn gold and pink at the edges. Jake talked easily, telling her about the ranch and his work, about growing up in Texas and moving to Arizona territory with his family 5 years ago. He asked about her life, and she found herself telling him things she had not meant to share, about her parents' deaths, her aunt's cruelty, the years of being invisible and unwanted. "You are not invisible to me," he said quietly. "I see you, Clara. I see how you carry yourself with dignity, even when people are cruel. I see the kindness in your eyes and the strength in the way you move to a new place alone, and I see a beautiful woman no matter what anyone told you." Her eyes filled with tears she could not stop. "Why? Why do you see me differently?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression earnest. Maybe because I'm looking with more than my eyes, my mother used to say that real beauty is not about perfect features. It is about the light that shines from inside a person. You have that light, Clara. You are beautiful in all the ways that matter. She kissed him then, suddenly and impulsively, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. He caught her waist, steadying her, and kissed her back with a tenderness that made her tremble. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Jake's eyes had darkened. "I should not have done that," Clara whispered. "I am glad you did." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I knew from the moment I saw you on that street. I knew you were the woman I have been waiting for." They walked back as the stars began to emerge, and at her uncle's door, Jake asked permission to court her properly. Thomas gave it, and Clara floated through the next days in a haze of happiness that felt unreal. Jake came every evening, and they walked and talked and learned each other. He told her about his dreams of expanding the ranch, of raising good horses and building something lasting. She told him about her love of books and her secret dream of teaching children to read someday. He listened as though every word mattered, and she began to believe that maybe, impossibly, she was worthy of this. On his 5th visit, he brought her wildflowers, a scraggly bouquet of desert blooms that she treasured more than roses. They sat on the porch as the sun set, and he told her about his family. "My mother will love you. My father is gruff but fair. My younger sister Emma will be thrilled to have another woman around. The ranch can be lonely for her." "When will I meet them?" Clara asked. "Soon. I want to do this right." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "This was my grandmother's. My mother gave it to me years ago. Said I would know when I found the right woman." He unwrapped it, revealing a simple gold ring with a small garnet. "Clara Hartwell, I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other 2 weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything. Will you marry me?" Her heart felt too large for her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jake, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit as though made for her. When he kissed her, the future suddenly looked bright and possible, and all the years of being told she was not enough melted away under the warmth of his love. They told her uncle, who opened a bottle of whiskey he had been saving and toasted their happiness. Samuel shook Jake's hand and clapped him on the shoulder, welcoming him to the family. They decided on a wedding 6 weeks away, time enough for arrangements and for Clara to meet Jake's family properly. She wrote a brief letter to her aunt, informing her of the engagement out of duty, but felt no need for the woman's approval or presence. The next day, Jake took her to the Flying W Ranch to meet his family. The ride was long under the August sun, but Clara barely noticed, too nervous and excited. The ranch sprawled across a valley with a main house built of adobe and wood, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and horses ran in a far pasture. It looked prosperous and well-maintained, and Clara felt a flutter of nerves. What if his family did not approve of her? But Jake's mother, Mary Morrison, was a warm woman with silver-streaked brown hair and her son's kind eyes. She embraced Clara immediately, welcomed her with genuine pleasure, and insisted on showing her the house and talking about wedding plans. Jake's father, Robert, was indeed gruff, but his handshake was firm and his eyes approving. Emma, 17 and pretty, hugged Clara and chattered excitedly about finally having a sister. The day passed in a blur of conversation and planning. Mary insisted that the wedding be held at the ranch, that she would help Clara make her dress, that they would invite the whole county and have a proper celebration. Clara, who had never experienced such wholehearted acceptance, felt tears threaten several times and had to blink them away. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Over the following weeks, Clara divided her time between keeping house for her uncle and preparing for the wedding. Mary came to town twice a week, bringing fabric and patterns, and together they sewed Clara's wedding dress, a simple but elegant design in cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Emma came along and helped with the veil. chattering about bows and horses and her hopes that Clara would teach her to bake better. Since her own attempts always resulted in burned offerings, Jake came every evening without fail, even when ranch work kept him late. They sat on the porch and talked about their future, about the small house on the ranch where they would start their married life, about children they hoped to have and dreams they wanted to chase. He kissed her goodnight with increasing passion, and Clara discovered feelings she had never known existed, a hunger that made her count the days until the wedding with impatience. 3 weeks before the wedding, trouble arrived in the form of Clara's aunt. The woman appeared in Tombstone without warning, descending from the stage in her severe black dress like a carrion bird. She arrived at Thomas's house with thin lips and cold eyes, looking around at the modest dwelling with obvious disdain. "Clara, I received your letter. I felt it my duty to come and ensure you are not making a terrible mistake." Aunt Judith's voice was sharp as ever. "A man who would marry you this quickly clearly has ulterior motives. What does he want? Your uncle's mine. What little inheritance you might have." Clara felt the old shame trying to rise, but pushed it down. "Jake wants me. He loves me." "Love," Judith sniffed. "A man does not love a face like yours, child. He tolerates it for other gains. I have tried to teach you this. You must be practical. You are not the sort of woman men desire. That is enough." Jake's voice came from the doorway, hard with anger. He had been approaching the house and heard through the open window. He stepped inside, his eyes blazing. "Mrs. Vernon, I do not know what kind of poison you have been feeding Clara all these years, but it stops now. She is beautiful. She is kind and strong and everything I want in a wife. And if you cannot see that, then you are the one to be pitied." Judith drew herself up, her face mottled with anger. "How dare you speak to me that way, young man? I am her family." "No," Clara said, finding her voice. "You were my jailer. Jake is my family now, and his parents, and Emma, and my uncle, people who love me for who I am. You need to leave, Aunt Judith. Go back to Philadelphia. You are not welcome at my wedding." Her aunt stared at her, shock clear on her face. "You ungrateful girl. After everything I did for you. You did nothing for me. You used me as free labor and told me every day that I was worthless. But I am not worthless. Jake sees that. I am beginning to see it too." Clara moved to stand beside Jake, and he put his arm around her waist. "Goodbye, Aunt Judith." The woman left in a fury, predicting doom and disaster, but Clara felt only relief. She turned into Jake's arms, and he held her tight, stroking her hair. "You were magnificent," he murmured. "I am so proud of you." That night, Clara looked at herself in the mirror again, but this time she saw herself through Jake's eyes. Her crooked nose gave her face character. Her freckles were like stars scattered across her skin. Her wide mouth was made for smiling and kissing the man she loved. The scar above her eyebrow was a mark of survival. She was not perfect by the world's standards, but she was perfect for Jake, and that was all that mattered. The final weeks before the wedding flew past in a rush of preparations. The house on the ranch was cleaned and furnished, with Mary donating extra linens and dishes, and Robert building new furniture in his workshop. Clara's dress was finished, hanging in her uncle's house like a promise. Invitations were sent, and responses came back, nearly everyone accepting. The whole territory seemed excited for a celebration. 2 days before the wedding, a problem arose. One of the ranch hands rode into town to report that a band of cattle rustlers had been spotted near the northern border of the Flying W. Robert and Jake, along with several other ranchers and some men from town, rode out to deal with the threat. Clara tried not to worry, but she paced the floor of her uncle's house, unable to settle. Mary and Emma came to stay with her, and the 3 women waited together, trying to distract themselves with last-minute wedding preparations. The men returned at dawn the next day, dusty and tired but unharmed. They had tracked the rustlers through the night and caught them trying to drive off a small herd. A brief gunfight had erupted, but the rustlers had been outnumbered and surrendered. The sheriff's men had taken them to jail in Tombstone, and the cattle were safe. Jake came straight to Clara, pulling her into his arms despite his dusty clothes, and she held him tight, breathing in the scent of him and thanking God he was safe. "Nothing could keep me from marrying you tomorrow," he whispered in her ear. "Not rustlers, not anything." The wedding day dawned clear and hot, the sky a brilliant blue without a cloud in sight. Clara woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. Mary and Emma arrived to help her dress, and the three women worked together in happy conspiracy, pinning up Clara's hair with wildflowers woven through the braids, settling the dress carefully over her head, arranging the veil. When Clara looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked radiant, her eyes shining, her smile wide and unguarded. "You are a beautiful bride," Mary said softly, tears in her eyes. "Jake is a lucky man." The wedding was held at the ranch in the late afternoon when the heat had eased. Chairs were set up under the cottonwood trees near the house, and nearly 100 people filled them, friends and neighbors from miles around. A minister from Tombstone stood ready, his Bible in hand. Clara's uncle walked her down the makeshift aisle, his arm steady under her hand, and she saw Jake waiting at the end dressed in his best suit, his eyes fixed on her with such love that her own eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their vows clearly, their voices strong despite their emotions. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed her thoroughly, and the crowd cheered. Clara laughed against his mouth, pure joy bubbling up, and he swept her into his arms and spun her around, making her dizzy and delighted. The celebration that followed lasted long into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of food that the community had contributed: roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread, vegetable dishes, pies and cakes. A fiddler played, and people danced on the swept dirt of the yard. Clara danced with Jake until her feet ached, then danced with her uncle and Robert and Samuel and half a dozen other men who lined up for the honor. She felt like a different person from the girl who had arrived in Tombstone 7 weeks ago, no longer invisible, but celebrated and cherished. As the stars filled the sky and the party continued, Jake took her hand and led her away to the small house that was now theirs. He carried her over the threshold, a tradition he insisted on, and set her down gently in the main room. A lamp burned low on the table, and someone, probably Mary, had left wildflowers in a vase and turned down the bed. "Alone at last, Mrs. Morrison," Jake said, smiling as he removed his hat and jacket. "Mrs. Morrison," Clara repeated, savoring the name. "I am your wife." "You are." He crossed to her, his hands gentle as he began removing the flowers from her hair. The most beautiful wife a man could ask for. She looked up at him. This man who had changed everything. "Do you know what you have given me? You have given me myself. You helped me see that I was never the problem. All those years I believed the lies, but you looked at me and saw the truth. The truth is easy to see when you're looking at someone you love." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again." He kissed her then, deep and slow, and Clara surrendered to the passion that had been building between them for weeks. They came together with tenderness and urgency, learning each other in the most intimate way, and Clara discovered that her body could be a source of joy rather than shame. Jake worshipped her with touch and words, calling her beautiful over and over until she believed it in her bones. They loved through the night, sleeping in snatches and waking to reach for each other again. And by morning, Clara felt transformed, not just married, but fully alive. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to live with another person, to navigate the rhythms of ranch life and the demands of being a wife. Clara threw herself into making their house a home, cooking and cleaning and tending the small garden she planted. She learned to ride, with Jake teaching her patiently, and discovered she loved the freedom of galloping across the open range with the wind in her hair. She helped Mary with the larger household when needed, and became close friends with Emma, teaching her to read better and sharing her love of books. Jake worked hard, up before dawn, and often not home until after sunset, but he always made time for Clara. They had dinner together every night, talking about their days, and he often brought her small gifts, an interesting rock, a feather, wildflowers. He told her daily that he loved her, that she was beautiful, and Clara bloomed under his devotion like a flower finally given enough water. The town of Tombstone proved more challenging. Some of the women who had mocked Clara that first day in the general store seemed unable to accept her happiness. They whispered when she came to town, made snide comments about Jake settling for less, suggested he must have ulterior motives. Clara tried to ignore them, but the words still stung. One day in November, Clara was in the general store buying supplies when she overheard two of those women talking. "I give it a year before he regrets marrying that plain creature. He will be looking for prettier company soon enough. Men always do." Something in Clara snapped. She walked over to the women, her chin high, her eyes steady. "You are right that my husband could have chosen someone with a more conventionally pretty face, but he chose me because he is wise enough to see beyond surface appearances. He values kindness, intelligence, and strength. I am sorry if your own marriages lack that depth, but your unhappiness is not my concern. Please stop speaking about me and my husband." The women gaped at her, shocked into silence, and Clara turned and walked out with her head high. Later, when she told Jake what had happened, he laughed and pulled her into his lap. "That is my fierce wife. I knew you had fire in you." As autumn turned to winter, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, with missed courses and morning sickness that left her pale and shaking. Mary confirmed her suspicions, and Clara told Jake one evening after dinner, nervous about his reaction. But his face transformed with joy, and he picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh and protest that he would make her sick again. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby. Clara, you have made me the happiest man alive." The pregnancy was not easy. Clara was sick most of the first few months, barely able to keep food down, and Jake hovered anxiously, trying to help in his clumsy, well-meaning way. But as she moved into the second half of the pregnancy, she felt better, and her body changed, her belly swelling with their child. Jake seemed fascinated by every change, touching her stomach gently and talking to the baby, telling it stories and promises about the life they would have. In late March of 1882, as the desert began to warm again, Clara went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through a day and a night, with Mary and the town's midwife attending her while Jake paced outside, nearly frantic with worry. But at dawn, their son was born. A healthy baby with a powerful cry and a thatch of dark hair like his father's. They named him Thomas, after Clara's uncle, and when Jake held him for the first time, tears streamed down his face. "He is perfect," Jake whispered, "just like his mother." Clara, exhausted and sore, felt her heart overflow with love for both of them, her husband and her son. This was her family, the one she had never thought she would have, and it was more precious than gold. The months that followed were busy and exhausting in the best way. Thomas was a demanding baby, hungry and loud, but Clara loved every moment, even the sleepless nights. Jake was a devoted father, coming in from work to hold his son, walking the floor with him when he cried, changing him without complaint. They were partners in everything, supporting each other through the challenges of new parenthood. Clara's uncle Thomas was diagnosed with consumption that summer, and despite their best efforts, he declined rapidly. He died in September, peaceful in his sleep, with Clara and Samuel at his bedside. In his will, he left his half of the mine to Clara, making her a woman of some means. Samuel continued to operate it, and the profits were split between them, giving Clara and Jake additional security. As young Thomas grew, he proved to be a happy, energetic child, running everywhere and getting into everything. Emma adored him and often took him for afternoons to give Clara a break. The ranch prospered, with Robert gradually turning over more responsibility to Jake as he aged. Jake proved to be a natural leader, respected by the ranch hands and trusted by his father. When Thomas was 2, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1884 she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Jake's grandmother. Rose was quieter than her brother had been, with her mother's brown hair and her father's green eyes, and she completed their family in a way Clara had not known they needed. Life on the ranch was not without difficulties. Droughts came, and sickness, and years when the cattle prices were poor. But Clara and Jake faced everything together, their bond growing stronger with each challenge. They built additions onto their house as their family grew, and planted trees that would provide shade for their grandchildren someday. They became pillars of the community, hosting gatherings and helping neighbors in need. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jake took Clara back to the spot where they had walked that first evening, where she had kissed him impulsively under the changing sky. They left the children with Mary and rode out alone, something they rarely got to do anymore. 5 years, Jake said, taking her hand as they stood looking out over the desert. 5 years since I saw you on that street and knew my life was about to change. Best decision I ever made, approaching you. Best decision I ever made, saying yes when you asked to call on me. Clara leaned against him, feeling his warmth through his shirt. Do you know what I think about sometimes? I think about what my life would have been if I had stayed in Philadelphia, if I had never come here. I would have spent my whole life believing I was not enough. You gave me everything, Jake. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me myself. You gave yourself those things, Clara. You were brave enough to leave everything you knew and start over. You were strong enough to stand up to your aunt. You were smart enough to see that what we had was worth fighting for. I just loved you. That was easy. They made love under the stars that night, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice, and rode home in the dawn feeling young and blessed. The years continued to unfold, bringing changes and growth. Robert Morrison died peacefully in 1888, and Jake took over running the ranch entirely. Mary lived with them after that, a beloved grandmother to the children, and a second mother to Clara. Samuel sold his share of the mine and moved to California, but he wrote regularly, and Clara treasured his friendship. Emma married a good man, a banker from Tucson, and had 3 children of her own. Thomas grew into a tall, serious boy who loved horses and wanted to be a rancher like his father. Rose was quieter, a reader like her mother, who loved learning and talked about becoming a teacher someday. Clara taught both children at home, using the books she had collected over the years, and took pride in their intelligence and kindness. The town of Tombstone changed too, growing and then declining as the silver mines played out. Some people moved away seeking opportunities elsewhere, but the Morrison family stayed, their roots deep in the Arizona soil. The ranch became one of the most respected in the territory, known for quality horses and honest dealings. On their 10th anniversary, Jake had a surprise for Clara. He had commissioned a photograph, still a relative novelty in the territory, and took her into town to have their portrait made. Clara fussed over her appearance, but Jake stopped her hand, smiling. "You are perfect," he said, "just as you are." In the photograph, which would hang on their wall for the rest of their lives, Clara is looking at Jake rather than the camera, her face transformed with love and happiness. He is looking at her the same way, and the connection between them is palpable, captured in shades of gray for posterity. Under the portrait, Jake had the photographer add words, "She is perfect to me." Years later, when Clara was in her 40s and Jake's hair had begun to silver at the temples, when their children were grown and beginning families of their own, when they had survived droughts and storms and all the challenges that life in the West could throw at them, Clara would sometimes look at that photograph and remember the girl she had been, the girl who believed she would never be loved, never be chosen, never be enough. And then she would look at Jake, still handsome, still devoted after all these years, and she would thank God for the day a cowboy had looked past her crooked nose and scattered freckles and seen the truth of who she was. He had not just told her she was beautiful, he had shown her every day through his actions and his love until she believed it herself. Thomas married a sweet girl from Tucson and took over day-to-day operations of the ranch, building a house near his parents so his children could grow up close to their grandparents. Rose became a teacher just as she had dreamed, opening a school in Tombstone that served children from all backgrounds, carrying on her mother's belief that education could change lives. Clara and Jake grew old together on the ranch they had built, their love deepening into something that went beyond passion into a profound companionship. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that never got old, holding hands with the easy comfort of people who knew each other completely. When Clara turned 50, Jake surprised her with a party, inviting what seemed like half the territory. As she looked around at the gathering, at children and grandchildren and friends and neighbors, at the life they had built together, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She had been told she would never be beautiful enough, never be wanted, never be loved. But she had found a man who saw her truly, who loved her not despite her imperfections, but including them, who had built a life with her that was richer and fuller than any she could have imagined. Late in the evening, Jake pulled her aside, away from the party, and kissed her with the same passion he had shown 20 years earlier. "Still perfect to me," he whispered against her lips. "Always will be." They lived to see their grandchildren grow, to celebrate their 40th anniversary surrounded by family, to watch Arizona become a state in 1912. They faced the new century together, marveling at automobiles and telephones and all the changes that came with progress. But some things never changed. Their love for each other, their commitment to family, their gratitude for the chance meeting on a dusty street in Tombstone that had altered both their destinies. When Jake died at 78, peaceful in his sleep with Clara beside him, she mourned deeply but without regret. They had been given 47 years together, more than many couples received, and every year had been a gift. At his funeral, she stood before the community and spoke of his kindness, his integrity, his love. She told the story of how they met, how he had seen her when others looked away, how he had called her perfect and meant it. Clara lived another 5 years after Jake's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored her. She spent her final years writing down the family stories, wanting future generations to know where they came from and what their grandparents had overcome. She wrote especially for the young girls in the family, wanting them to know that beauty came in many forms, that being told you were not enough did not make it true, that the right person would see your worth even when others were blind to it. She died in 1931 at 83 years old, surrounded by family, with Jake's photograph on the table beside her bed. Her last words were, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They buried her next to Jake on the hill overlooking the ranch, under the cottonwood trees they had planted together decades earlier. The headstone was simple, listing her name and dates, and below that the words Jake had spoken to her that first day and had proved true every day after. "You are perfect to me." The ranch continued through the generations, and the story of Clara and Jake became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It became a reminder that love sees what others miss, that worth is not determined by conventional beauty, that the cruelest voices are often the most wrong. It was a story of transformation, not because Clara changed, but because she finally saw herself through the eyes of someone who truly loved her. And in the end, that made all the difference. Clara Hartwell Morrison had been told she would never be beautiful enough, but a cowboy had looked at her and seen perfection, and together they had built a life of love and purpose and joy that lasted beyond their years and inspired everyone who knew their story. The girl who had been invisible became a woman who was truly seen, and in being seen, she finally saw herself. That was the greatest gift Jake gave her, and the one she treasured most. Not just his love, but the ability to love herself. Their story proved that beauty was not about perfect features or flawless skin, but about being loved and loving in return, about being brave enough to believe that you deserved happiness, about finding someone who saw you truly and chose you anyway, not despite your imperfections, but because of the totality of who you were. And so their love story ended not with tragedy or separation, but with a life fully lived, a family deeply cherished, and a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. It was the happy ending Clara had never dared to dream of, and it was real and true and earned through courage and faith and the transformative power of being seen by someone who truly mattered. In the wild west of Arizona territory, in the heat and dust and wide open spaces, two people had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would last forever.